kind of have to make hay while the sun is shining earlier in life and build a bit of a reservoir of those things, like while you're young and fit and capable, because life has that tendency of coming and biting you in the ass. As you get older, you have more responsibilities, kids and job and, elderly people in your family. These are all things that can pull you away from having time to devote to fitness.
Welcome to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast. Our guest today has a PhD in exercise physiology. He's an ex-MMA athlete, author, lecturer, and a successful strength and conditioning coach. The key elements of his programming include the 7 pillars of movement and the 10 principles of exercise progression. His philosophy is heavily grounded in the biomechanics of human motion, identifying opportunities for training high-performance athletes and accelerating the recovery process in his clients. Today, he talks us through the grand theory of exercise science, how to apply what he calls the McDonald's principle into fitness programming, and how you should be adapting your training program based on your genetics and skeletal build. So please welcome Dr. Pat Davidson to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast. Mr. Pat Davidson, thank you for joining us on today's podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me on here, Matthew. Looking forward to getting into this here today.
We're connected through a mutual friend, Dr. Gabrielle Leon, and she talks very highly of you.
Well, I have her blackmailed to do that, so that's just how those things work. Like, she says anything not nice, and there's like a button that gets hit, and the floodgates open. So that's how I take care of that.
I was listening to the podcast you did with her, which was very interesting, and I got to a place actually. I thought it would be an interesting place just to start a bit of a side topic. But you were talking about something called the grand theory of exercise science, and I thought I'd ask you a little bit more. What was that? Is it some kind of new research paper that's been done? Is it?
I don't even think it's that new, to tell you the truth. The grand unifying theory, aka the constraints paper, and I don't remember the authors, unfortunately, on that one. It's a pretty easy one to find, but it is this statement that this topic of constraints is what links everything together. So constraints are kind of like, I don't know, bumper bowling. You have to put the bumpers on the alley, and when you create those boundaries, it allows things to move in a direction. Like, no direction in life happens unless there's constraints put on a system. So within that paper, it talks about 3 different levels of constraints: individual constraints, environmental constraints, and task constraints. So individual constraints for human beings is primarily based on the shape of your skeleton. We have different shaped skeletons. Some people have long femurs and other people have short femurs. Some people have a pelvis with a certain shape to it. Others have a different shape. The shape of your rib cage. Some people are a bit pear-shaped, other people are tornado-shaped, and the general shapes that you assume are what are very largely associated with some of your movement capabilities. And it's somewhat difficult to change some of those shapes. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like there's tremendous room for changing your femur length once you're an adult. But there are some modifiable things. I mean, even dentistry is capable of changing, your teeth or bones, and they make up part of your skeleton. So there is some modifiable nature to that one. But in some ways, like, your overall skeletal shape is what it is. And the articulations and shape of the bones of your skeleton largely determine your overall movement capabilities. Like, you can only bend so far with your joints based upon those orientations of the bones relative to each other. So appreciating that the way in which people move is largely based on the stereotype of a human skeleton, and then the individual differences between us is an important phenomenon, as well as like surgeries and how those might modify your shoulder, hip, knee, whatever it is, and change those movement possibilities through new constraints. Then you have environmental constraints, which is sort of like the world around you that you're finding yourself in from an exercise standpoint changes the ways in which you can do things. If you're trying to run in a swamp, It's going to be very different than on a track surface, for instance. Or wind can be a very powerful thing, or altitude. It has a limitation that can be imposed, or it can feed towards certain characteristics being more important under certain contexts. And then task constraints. That could be the way in which you try to accomplish a specific task changes the approach or how someone would go about moving. And in the gym, oftentimes that's sort of like the kind of bar that you might use, or a machine, a dumbbell, like those create different task constraints. So understanding the ways in which those things come together seems to be the like that was proposed as the grand unifying theory of exercise science, that ultimately uh, you have some control over environmental and task constraints as a professional. And if you know how to manipulate those things in the right way, you drive people towards certain outcomes from their exercise, uh, performance and progress over time.
It's quite interesting, really. For today's conversation, I was going to address general population as opposed to athletes, which is very very different story. But one of the things I find with a lot of people I talk about, a lot of people I talk with, and a lot of professionals in the business, is that the general population probably don't appreciate some of those constraints. And so what you see and hear a lot of is people going and getting ridiculous surgeries or pushing themselves to a position to try and get a particular body shape. Let's take men, for example, where they feel as though they have the ability to get a particular body shape, but probably don't realize and appreciate that there are certain constraints that will always prevent them having a particular chest or bicep or whatever. And yet without that knowledge, they pursue in somewhat dangerous directions to get something that's actually unachievable without surgery. And I guess my question to you is, what do you think is the role of a trainer to probably help educate people to prevent them, in some case, probably killing themselves to try and get that end?
So I think it's a really tricky topic, because it's sort of this, you don't want to create nocebo effects in people's heads by telling them certain things about themselves or limiting them. That's something in the medical community that's a big deal. Like, you have to be very careful with the way that you word things, because if you plant a negative idea in someone's head about movement or their body, then they can become hyper fixated on that particular thing. And that can move them towards a really fragile mindset, rather than someone that can be more rugged in their self concept and fairly resilient as a being. So I very rarely tell anyone that they can't do something, but at the same time, what I'm reminded of is sometimes you can just give people good advice and funnel them towards their strengths. And what I always think of is, when I was a kid, I'm 5'6" right now. I weigh about 200 pounds. And when I was a young kid, I was very good at basketball. But I remember my grandfather, when I was maybe like 7 or 8 years old, him being like, "Hey, maybe you should try being a catcher in baseball." Like, just I'm thinking about everyone else in our family and their height and their shape, and nobody's really the right shape and look for basketball. I think that over time, you're probably going to find yourself going more in this trajectory, like wrestling or catching is probably a better fit for you. And I remember at the time being like, you don't know what you're talking about, old man. But I think he was probably right on the money, that if you sort of look at, people that tend to be good at things, there's commonalities in populations. Um, so when I think about those kinds of things, like, a good friend of mine, Bill Hartman, he's a physical therapist in Indiana, a really brilliant guy, and he has a few primary shapes of skeletons that he proposes, and he has the wide, narrow, the wide wide, the narrow narrow, and the narrow wide. And what he's speaking about is really the shape of your overall, like your trunk, the top of your rib cage, and then down to the bottom of your rib cage, top of your pelvis. And so wide narrow, for instance, is your classical kind of tornado shaped person, versus the narrow wide would be your pear shaped person. The narrow narrow is someone whose body type is almost like the cardboard on the inside of a paper towel roll, and the wide wide is like just a thick kind of refrigerator with arms and legs coming at you. And each of those body types tends to have a trajectory towards what they're going to be best at. Where the wide narrow is oftentimes really explosive people that jump very high and run very fast. The wide wide is usually very good at strength activities, like your offensive linemen in football, or shot putters are oftentimes wide wides. The narrow narrows are oftentimes your endurance athletes. And the narrow wides are very good at rotating. It's almost the same shape as a top that spins very well. So sometimes you'll see that as like corner infielders in baseball and softball that hit home runs. So when I think, and like the physics on some of these things are really interesting. Like, why is the narrow narrow really good at endurance sports? And what Bill talks about is that he gets into the physics of pistons inside camshafts, and the way in which, like, if you have a narrow camshaft and a piston moving through that, it doesn't take much pressure to move that piston inside that camshaft, versus the really wide camshaft. It takes a tremendous amount of pressure, and there's a lot of resistance in movement there, which is advantageous. That's how a car lift works in a mechanic's garage. It's a wide cylinder, and if I use the pressure of hydraulics to push down on one side, it can lift a car very easily because of the amount of pressure involved. So with a human being, the cylinder is the thorax, the rib cage, and the abdomen, and the piston is the diaphragm inside. And if I'm going to do endurance running or cycling or something like that, that diaphragm has to pump up and down a lot of times to be able to accomplish that task. And with someone that has that narrow shoulders, narrow rib cage, narrow hips, it's low resistance for the diaphragm to be able to pump up and down very easily. So they're going to have efficient activity for that repetitive, high breathing rate, up and down kind of pumping motion that's associated with endurance activity in general, versus somebody that is wide, wide. They're probably going to be gassed. Trying to run a mile or something might be extremely difficult for that person, but that person is probably going to be able to like push someone over really effectively because of the amount of pressure that they have inside their system and how forceful they can be. Like, that's the person that could like pull the plow, or in football, like push the whole line back or something like that, or squat a lot of weight. So when you think about these things and like the predisposition that someone might have towards activity, you might in your head, if you understand this, begin to think to yourself, well, this person that's a client that just came in, I can kind of look at them. They have more of this narrow build. I don't know if lifting weights every day is going to necessarily be their superpower. They might really benefit from being a little bit more pushed towards aerobic training and circuit work, and they're probably going to be good at that. And the thing is that people like what they're good at. And when it comes to getting people to be exercisers, you want to give them a positive experience. Like, I don't like I'm a wide wide. Like, I'm not good at endurance activity. If I come in and someone's like, okay, we got treadmill running, and then we're gonna get on the bike, and then we're gonna do jumping jacks, I'm like, how about I just bench press and squat? Like, I can do that, man. Like, I'm cool with that. And so, and on the flip side, so just sort of appreciating, like, if I've got that wide narrow, we might do a lot of fast activity, jumping, powerful stuff. If I've got the narrow, I might have that trajectory going a little bit more towards endurance activity. And a wide, I might start with some strength training and letting them feel really comfortable with barbells. And with the narrow wide, a lot of times rotational activities, being able to get them to throw a medicine ball or chop some lift with a stick or a cable or something like that. you know, Overall, once someone's comfortable and they're in there and they're exercising a lot, I can start to feed them some other things that maybe they're not as good at. But the most important thing in my mind is, especially these days in the modern Western world, getting people to be consistent movers. And once they have that habit ingrained in their life, now we have some wiggle room and we can try some other things. But I like to not make mistakes with people, and starting with people's strengths, I think, is a really smart move to ensure that they enjoy the activity and are more likely to stick with it.
Introducing the next big thing in functional training, the Escape Barrow, a revolutionary training tool that combines a loaded farmer's carry with a sled push to develop hip, grip, and core strength. Developed in partnership with Pete Holman, inventor of the TRX Rip Trainer and Nautilus Glute Drive, the Escape Barrow can be rolled, pushed, dragged and carried. The Escape Barrow packs a punch with an impressive load capacity of 440 pounds, and with a two-stage galvanized paint covering process, it's also ideal for outdoor use. So head over to escapefitness.com/barrow. That's escapefitness.com/barrow to find out more. Enjoy the rest of this episode. Again, coming back to the general population where maybe, someone will be going to a trainer to get some sort of physical improvement as well as health. Health is obviously a key thing, but there's some aesthetic part of it. How do you go about, in a similar way to what your grandfather talked to you about basketball, how would you do that with body shapes where you kind of know that if somebody's got that sort of wide shape that kind of having this sort of V-shaped Frank Zane type of physique is probably going to be unlikely to a certain extent. How do you sort of get people in a positive way to probably accept and to work towards a goal, feeling good about themselves, but also prevent them pushing for something that's going to be relatively difficult based on those sort of, the natural physics that they have?
Right. Yeah, that's like the $1,000,000 question, I feel like, because it's like, hey, I'm a wide and I want to be a wide narrow. What do I do? And it's like, well, your skeleton shape is like largely genetically driven, and then your muscular development, that's sort of, it's kind of like nature versus nurture sort of a topic where you can superimpose muscle that may not match exactly with your skeleton shape. So I would say that skeleton is inherited and muscle superimposition is kind of like your environment or your lifelong stuff that's modifiable. But the thing is you kind of want to match it. You know what I mean? Like if I think that you might be getting into some murky territory, trying to take a narrow and turn them into a bodybuilder. That's like a really hard ask. A wide can probably handle a lot of loading. Like they've usually, a lot of other parts of their body will like a fractal representation. Like you'll see kind of the thicker elbows and wrists, and knees and ankles. And so they're kind of built to be able to sustain that sort of loading over time. And it's kind of like everybody needs a little bit of everything, so I look at it like, what's the main dish versus the seasoning of this thing? Where if I want to be sustainable, I should probably have my narrows main dish be a little bit more on the aerobic side and repeated activity. And then the seasoning that I would sprinkle on them would be some fast things, jumping high, throwing med balls fast, running pretty fast from time to time, and some strength stuff, so lifting. With the wide, the main dish is probably going to be, compound resistance training, strength training, getting pretty strong over time. And then the seasoning is going to be the endurance activity and the faster things. The wide narrow, the main dish is going to be the really athletic stuff: run, jump, throw, cut. And the seasoning is going to be the lifting and the endurance activity. And the narrow wide, the main ingredients in my mind are kind of throw, rotate with power. And then the seasoning for them would be the jumping and the lifting and the faster locomotion and stuff like that. Like, from a health perspective, the our species is pretty stereotypical. When you really parse through all the data, it's kind of like you need a certain amount of muscle mass. You want muscle mass to go up, you want fat mass to come down, and you want a high aerobic fitness level. If you have that, you're checking a lot of the boxes that would be associated with decreasing mortality risk and increasing your really quality activities of daily living stuff for a longer period of time in your life. So, the recipe for muscle mass going up, fat mass going down, and aerobic fitness going up, it's pretty straightforward. You have to lift weights progressively over time for muscle mass. You have to practice pretty decent dieting for fat mass, and you have to do aerobic exercise for aerobic fitness. So everyone needs to do those things. It's just a question of like how much. For muscle mass, we're not talking about like you don't need to be able to step on stage for a bodybuilding show to have adequate levels of muscle mass. It's pretty meager amounts of muscle mass that's considered to be threshold level for health based stuff. For VO2 and aerobic fitness, we're not talking about like, competing in the Tour de France either. We're talking about like pretty modest levels of fitness. So I would say like the big thing to keep in mind though is all of those things are going to go down over time. You kind of have to make hay while the sun is shining earlier in life and build a bit of a reservoir of those things like while you're young and fit and capable, because life has that tendency of coming and biting you in the ass. As you get older, you have more responsibilities, kids and job and, elderly people in your family. These are all things that can pull you away from having time to devote to fitness. So while you have time, you really need to allocate it towards building a bank account of this stuff, because it will tend to decline over time. So the higher you have it at any point, the further away from a critical decline point it will be for the future. And from a really like an epigenetic memory standpoint, if you built it up pretty high at any point in your life, it's much easier to recapture that in the future with any investment of time into your fitness development as well.
Mm. One of the things that I've been talking about with several people on the podcast for a while, and on and off the podcast really, is assessment. And if you look at the fitness space now, whether it's online or bricks and mortar, there's a number of different fitness products out there. They continue to develop, and there's lots of ways really for people to try and to get into some sort of movement. Now, whether that's the right type of movement for the particular person or not is an interesting subject. But I was curious from your perspective. You've worked with a lot of people, from athletes to regular regular people, and I was curious to get your views on assessment, because the more people that I tend to talk with, it seems as though it's very difficult to say, well, you just need to move. You go and join a fitness studio, and that's your first step to fitness. And I guess from your perspective, for somebody that obviously realizes they need to get fit and healthy, whether they want to do it from an aesthetic perspective or they need to do it for a health perspective, what are your recommendations on that entry point? Is it a case of just getting off the couch and moving, or is it advisable to have some sort of assessment in terms of where the best point for you to start on your journey?
I think it's such a really good question that can go in a lot of directions from an answer. And, when I think of assessments in fitness, I really think that the overall movement started with great intentions coming from Gray Cook in the 1990s. And he was the person that created the functional movement screen. And, kind of around that same time, maybe a little bit after, you had and the like NASM, National Association of Sports Medicine, creating their movement screen as well for training. But really, I think Gray Cook kind of started the process. And he has a really great book, Athletic Body and Balance. And he kind of looked at the body. He had a lot of training from the physical therapists coming from the Czech Republic, really brilliant minds like Vladimir Yanda. And their overall thought process was that the human body is kind of divided into two groups of muscles. You have tonic muscles and phasic muscles, or like postural muscles, and then movement driving muscles. And their concept was kind of that the body can become out of balance when there's inequality between those postural and movement driving muscles. And Gray Cook had this thought process that like we would have these overpowered athletes, that their movement muscles were just so dominant over their postural muscles, and that in some ways like that's like the essence of tightness and restricted movement. And you'd have one muscle on one side of a joint be really tight and strong, and the other side of the joint would be long and weak. And he devised this functional movement screen as a tool that he believed would kind of evaluate that, like what's the overall extent to which you've become an athletic body out of balance. And he had really good early success with some of the research findings in this. In particular, like there was a very early study with NFL football players that was showing that if they scored under a 14 on this test and had more than one asymmetry, that they were 50% more likely to get injured from a non-contact injury. Unfortunately, there was never a follow-up finding even close to that. And then kind of the sledgehammer of research came down on this thing over time with a lot of studies on it. And they found that it actually didn't measure anything other than itself. And so it's like, ooh, okay, we got to throw this thing out. It doesn't do anything. They tried to talk about, well, it's just a screen to catch things. And it's like, well, what does it catch? Blood pressure is a good screen. It catches people that are at risk for, anything that's a cardiac or vascular based issue from a health perspective. It's a great screen, a blood pressure test. The functional movement screen doesn't seem to screen for anything. You could have a very low score, you could have asymmetries, and there doesn't seem to be an increased risk of gym-based injuries whatsoever. And it's not going to tell you if you're good at squatting or bench pressing necessarily. It just tells you if you're good at that test. So from the perspective of that, which would be a real big fail from a research evaluation standpoint, when research says that you only measure yourself inside of a test, that's as heavy a hand of saying this thing's gone as anything ever could be. So I think that Gray Cook was I don't know if you've ever read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but I think that was a book, like that book said that the premise of the book is that Socrates was the worst thing that ever happened to Western society. And that what Socrates did was early Greek sophists were believed strongly in the concept of the good, and that there was just this overall essence of something that is good. Some things are good and some things are not good, and that you kind of see it and know it when you're around the good, and you don't when you're not around it, but that it's impossible to define. And Socrates was obsessed with being able to define things, and he really kind of created the essence of reductionist science as a thought process. And because you can't define good, Socrates was like, the concept's out. Okay, we're just going with that which we can reduce and divide, because dividing and conquering from a thought process is incredibly powerful and useful. And we can utilize that as a really strong tool. And some would say that that's actually the thing that kind of got Socrates in trouble from poisoning the minds of the youth and then having to be euthanized with hemlock. But but his viewpoints really persisted through Plato and other thinkers after that, and became the foundation of Western thought from a reductionist standpoint. Um, and but that's unfortunate, because the good is a real thing. It's just really hard to actually define. And qualitative research tries to do it, but it's really hard. And most of the time, qualitative research just creates pencil and paper tests to be able to try to quantify things. So I think that Gray Cook just fell victim to the same concept of trying to measure the good movement. What is good movement? It's really hard to actually define it. It's one of those things that you know it when you see it. Like, wow, that person moves really fluidly and beautifully. That person, not so much. Like, hey, that's a really nice squat. That's really beautiful running. That's a great throw of a javelin. But like you can see when it is and when it isn't. But the really hard part is to dissect why that's good and why something else is not good. And it's to me, I like really incredibly brilliant people have been trying to figure out anatomy and physiology for thousands of years. Like going way back, the Galen, the Greek doctor, Vesalius, the incredible Renaissance anatomist. These are brains. Da Vinci. I mean, the best brains ever have been obsessed with anatomy and physiology, and they would probably conclude by saying like, yeah, we don't really fully understand it, to tell you the truth. Like, and so I look at like I look at live in vivo biology occurring as one of the most complicated phenomena that could possibly exist. And so I really deeply appreciate moving life forms, animated matter, and the severity of its complexity is astonishing to me. And I would say that there is no way that my brain or any other brain or even artificial intelligence at this point would be able to wrap its collective mind around movement. It's too profound. A human brain has to put constraints on itself to protect it from the overwhelming complexity of the universe. Like, we don't allow ourselves to be able to see the full light spectrum or to be able to hear the full sonic spectrum. We don't get to interact with full reality because full reality is too overwhelming. So we delimit the amount of existence that we participate in, and our brains themselves build small conceptual models of existence so that we don't basically go insane from trying to make sense of a too chaotic world around us. And in our own lives, we shrink our lives down to acceptable levels of being able to interact with it to prevent ourselves from feeling overwhelmed by life and all that it brings with it. So I really enter the conversation with that as my backdrop of, I can't understand it. It's too big. And there's more than one correct explanation for anything this complicated. Anything that is on a level of complexity that to that degree has more than one correct answer for explaining how it works. So I, knowing this, still went and tried to create what I believe is a model that represents good movement versus not good movement. It's my best guess. And so I created a system that tries to say that there's competent exercise versus incompetent exercise. And, I try to divide it into different planes of movement. It can get pretty technical in some ways, where I really went back to trying to think about what is the essence of a human. And to be able to do that, I studied the comparative evolutionary anatomy between humans and our closest relative, chimpanzees. So I looked at the diversion of the shapes of the skeletons of chimps and humans, and the way in which the human went upright. And Darwin very strongly believed that all of the evolutionary drive towards the presentation of modern humans occurred as a result of going upright with bipedalism. And I put a lot of stock in Charles Darwin. I think that that's a good brain to be able to hitch your wagon to and say, if he says bipedalism is the main driver, I want to know about bipedalism. And I really focused my attention on the changes in the human pelvis shape, the changes in the human spine shape, and then the changes in the human foot as compared to the chimpanzee. And when you look at those differences, the primary thing that you see is that chimpanzees have their mass pitched forward in space, in all ways, shapes, and forms. If you look at a chimp's foot, it looks like our hand, where their big toe is perpendicular to the direction of all their other toes. It's a really good foot for climbing a tree and shimmying up a tree, but it requires the upper body to be out in front of the lower body for it to work appropriately. If you look at the head and the skull of a chimpanzee, the neck of the animal goes into the back of the skull. The hole that the spine enters the skull through, the foramen magnum, is located at the back of a chimpanzee's skull. For a human, the hole is more towards the middle of the skull. So, like a human's neck goes into the middle of the head, a chimp's neck goes into the back of the head. Because the chimp's neck is going into the back of its head, the weight of the chimp's head is out in front of the body. It's the same design as any four-legged animal, essentially. Like a horse has a neck that goes into the back of its head, a dog goes into the back of its head, a chimp goes into the back of its head. A human has all these modifications that allow for the center of mass to be pulled backwards as compared to a four-legged animal with its center of mass going forwards. So to me, I analyze everything from distribution and location of the center of mass of the organism. And when center of mass is held back, there are stereotypical ways in which our species moves, and there are stereotypical muscles that respond to be able to keep the center of mass back. So I created
So just to jump in there
yeah,
quickly, Pat.
absolutely.
So obviously that makes sense, and I guess the design and the way things are perfectly in balance to do a function, to do a particular function makes sense. Now, I suppose as human beings, as we get older and we sit down like we're doing here, I suppose we become more chimp-like. We're
Yeah.
bent over. Does that have any? Are
Right
we
on the
going back?
money.
Are we reversing back to being chimps again in some respects?
That's exactly the model that I created. The more that you are going backwards in time from an evolutionary standpoint, the more that you're going to move like a chimpanzee.
Right.
And the primary thing that a chimpanzee does from a movement perspective, if you put it on two legs, is it wobbles back and forth like a penguin or like a drunk person when it tries to move. It compensates movement wise that way. So everything that I do from an examination standpoint is looking at, well, how much do you compensate from a tilting back and forth side to side or turning too far perspective when you shouldn't? Because if you're doing that, and this is a phenomenon that's known as not the movement thing, but what you brought up, the backwards movement in time through evolution. That's a concept referred to as Jacksonian dissolution. The English neurobiologist John Hewlings Jackson in 1851 created, or he postulated this theory, and he was talking about the human brain. And essentially, whenever you're confronted with stress in life, the most modern version of what the animal has goes offline. And you have to revert backwards in time to older models of anatomy to be able to power you through those circumstances. Even your brain, so your brain works that way. Your prefrontal cortex is the most modern thing. It's the thing that allows you to be calm and communicative, and as Robert Sapolsky would say, it allows you to do the right thing when the right thing is the harder thing to do.
Like
And
that.
when you are stressed, what happens is the prefrontal cortex goes offline and you go backwards in time and use older parts of your brain, emotional parts, the amygdala, all these stress centers. And that's when you see someone in line at the grocery store and their card gets declined and they've got three kids and they're screaming at them and they freak out at the cashier. You know what I mean? Like, it's never good behavior. But it's a stress response. So with all things. And this is not just, biology. Literally all of your appliances work the same way. You know what I mean? Like the newest, fanciest things, they always break when stress happens. And then you have to go to like older models. I talk about alarm clocks with that a lot. Like when they invented those like CD player, alarm clocks, and then the power goes out. Man, the alarm doesn't go off, or the radio station turns off, or something. But the one that you could wind up with the bell and the hammer that rings, that thing's always going to work. It doesn't matter if the electricity goes out or anything. It only does one thing. It's very unsophisticated, but it will work under almost any circumstances. The same thing as the AK-47 assault rifle. You can drag that thing through the mud. You can bring it into freezing weather. It's always going to work. The thing was built in Russia in 1947. All of the modern machine guns, they jam, they freeze, they can shoot bullets with a, velocity that's tremendous, but they aren't as reliable. The older, more reliable, less sophisticated thing. So for human beings, they just resort to older, more reliable, less sophisticated movement strategies as stress increases. And there's times where that should happen. Stress is normal in exercise. It's like I think about from loading. If you're going to deadlift and you need to deadlift more and more weight, basically I want you to look like a gorilla. You know what I mean? Like you need to drop off all of the modern fluid human movements, and you need to lock down and basically become a four-legged animal attached to a barbell. I just hope that as stress drops, that you can return back to being a fluid, upright, rotating, beautifully moving human being. So that's kind of the overall concept. It's almost like when you're deadlifting in life when you shouldn't be deadlifting, that's the problem. When you can't move up and down that evolutionary time ladder and you're stuck in the past, that's the issue.
So for someone that is thinking about getting, choosing a program, then are they? Because I suppose you could, if you are becoming an ape or monkey or whatever you terminology you use, and let's say someone says, okay, well, go and do this HIIT class, for example. Is there a danger of making the situation, the kind of gorilla type of situation, worse? And what advice would you give to people? Because it almost sounds like you probably want to kind of go back to being an unstressed human and standing upright.
Yeah.
That seems as though that's your priority before you continue with your deadlifts, continuing to sort of make you like a gorilla. Is that a sort of have I oversimplified the concept? And if so, how would I go about deciding where to start?
I love that you brought it up. It's a perfect question because, one of the main things I'm trying to do is not scare people. Okay. Like you have to earn turning into a gorilla in some ways. You know what I mean? Like you have to have trained. Like, okay, imagine watching a team of bodybuilders go for a run, a jog. You can imagine how they would run. They look funny. They kind of lurch from side to side. They have trained themselves so hard and so much that they've gotten into that state. Most people don't look like that when they move. Most people are right in the middle of the bell curve, which is about where you should be. You have to almost be kind of crazy to get yourself to the point where you've trained with a single modality so much that you've actually pushed yourself over to that side of the spectrum. Now it can happen with aging. It gets presented with that. You know what I mean? Like you see somebody that's 85 years old and they're basically in the same position as a chimpanzee when they're holding onto a walker. And if you ask them to stand up straight, they're still kind of like lurched forward, and they oftentimes have to walk by swinging side to side. Like that's time is undefeated. It's the heavyweight champion. It's got no losses. It'll get you eventually, and at some point that will happen to your movement where you have to basically rock side to side to go forward. But most people aren't really there. Like when I'm thinking about assessments, I only assess people that are in pain. Like I want to see if otherwise, for the most part, you only have so many exercises you have for people to do that are effective. You go to a fitness facility and you have squat, hinge or deadlift, you have pushing things horizontally, you have pushing things vertically, you have pulling things horizontally, pulling things vertically, you have locomotion, you have throwing balls, you have jumping. You know what I mean? Like, I only have a playbook that's so big for things that actually are challenging physical activities. Yes, there's smaller exercises, bicep curls, tricep extensions, shoulder lateral raises, but those are more advanced, in some ways, advanced exercises for people that have already done a significant amount of the basic stuff. Most people need basic foundational big motor patterns: push, pull, squat, hinge, jump, run, throw. That's kind of like the playbook that I have in my mind. And so I need you to do those things. And I want people to squat in some way, shape, or form. Like, I'm not going to throw that motor pattern out based on really almost any test. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to squat with a barbell on their back for heavy weights. It might mean often, like, the way that I structure things is I try to think about how much support does somebody need to learn how to do an exercise properly, you know? And support in the gym comes in a lot of ways. It could be a machine, like a hack squat machine, for instance, provides a lot of support. It's got a backrest, it's got handles for your hands. The machine itself is on a trajectory that goes up and down. It's got a foot plate. It's like you almost can't do the thing wrong. You're going to squat up and down with that piece of equipment, and almost no matter how clueless you'd be with exercise. So that would be, to me, like something that would be like maximal support for someone to be able to learn the essence of the movement. Because to me, a squat is just moving your pelvis up and down through space. A deadlift is moving your pelvis forwards and backwards through space. Horizontal pushing is moving your hands close to your body and then horizontally away from it. Like, these are big, zoom out from it a little bit. Don't get caught up, as I've heard some people say, don't start picking the fly shit out of the pepper with some of these things. Like, see the big essence of the movements. And some of these things, I'm never gonna throw any of them out unless I absolutely have to. If someone's had, two hip replacements or something like that, and they have absolute limitations about being able to squat up and down, if that's the case, I might have an issue where I can't utilize that. But if it's not that, I'm going to find some version of a squat that the person can do. Oftentimes it'll be something like a heel elevated squat where the person's holding a weight in front of them. And the reason I do that, to kind of go back to our original conversation about constraints and the environment, from a really big picture standpoint, I've always just watched people doing their thing in life and had, thought about, like, hey, what's going on with this? If you watch people walk up a hill, oftentimes they stick their butt back and they're basically in a hinge position, and they drive themselves up from a hinge. When people walk down a hill, they do a little bit of a squat, and they have to kind of squat their way down the hill. And if somebody is about to fall down a hill, they'll always drop their butt down into a squat. So whenever it is that I'm looking to support someone and give them a squat movement that's very easy and for them to understand, I always think to myself, well, how can I build a downhill for them in the gym? Sometimes I'll put 5-pound plates under their heels. Other times, maybe there is like an actual wedge, like a metal wedge in the gym that they could stand on, a 2x4, anything like that, where I elevate their heels and put their body on a downhill. Because when you're going downhill, you reflexively and automatically shift your weight backwards. And when I keep your weight backwards, it makes it very easy for you to move up and down like an elevator through space. If I want somebody to hinge properly, a lot of times I'll try to construct some kind of an uphill challenge for them in the gym. And that might be like putting a band behind them and anchoring it to the floor and running it through their legs and having them hold on to it that way. So the band itself is actually on a hill. and they'll reflexively sit their hips back in space when they encounter that kind of a force. So I'm always modifying everything around them to kind of create a situation where the body has to respond the way that I want it to in the beginning. And then I can begin educating that person about what their body's doing. And they can begin to connect the sensation and the movement experience with the cognition of understanding what's happening. But I always try to use everything to my advantage to set them up for success initially. And then we can get into, because the human brain, we're very cognitive in the Western world, you know, it, but if you go through therapy, talk therapy doesn't work as well as somatic therapy from the research experience. And exercise is the ultimate somatic experience that there is. Like, talk exercise is the worst thing in the world. I try not to talk
Give
to
me an
people too
example of
much.
when you say talk exercise. Just give me an example.
Sure. Okay, we're gonna squat here, Matt. And what I want you to do is I want you to, point your toes slightly out at 15 degrees. I want you to spread the floor and turn your feet out like you're corkscrewing the floor away. I want you to grip the bar and feel like you're making the bar turn into an upside down U on your back. Really engage your lats. Don't forget to breathe, and then engage your core and brace. Now that you're doing that, I want you to sit your hips down and have your knees go forward. You're like, oh God, like, to me, it's sort of like, hey, do me a favor, go up and down. That's about the extent to which I'll say to people if I build the right exercise for them in the early part of their training.
Is that
And
when
now
you
that
would probably use more machines then, as opposed to, say, some of the functional training tools that are out there? You would start people on a machine where you got a very fixed path.
that's exactly what I do, because I look at it as, how much support do you need in the beginning? And I think that's a universal concept for people. Anytime you're introduced to a new concept or a new experience in life, you probably need support.
Mm.
And when you start to feel comfortable, now I can remove support systematically from this experience until you are pretty autonomous and you can make your own choices. I look, like, I spent enough time training people to realize, wow, I'm just their parent right now. Like, adults will look at you like a little kid will. Hey, am I doing this right? It's almost like if you get a little too far out of their sight too, they like start looking for you. And I was like, wow, this is that is what this job is. I am their exercise parent. I need to model
So
the
how
behaviors. Go ahead.
So
Yeah.
how just to jump in there. So if you look at let's say some of these hit circuit programs that are around where you're doing barbell lifts and kettlebell stuff, like for your based on what you're saying, then if someone's never really been into a gym before, are you saying then that before you really want to go to do that sort of stuff, you need to build this sort of relatively fixed plane strength first before you're going to put someone onto more of a complex exercise, which could be relatively unstable? Or is it just a case of, well, how would you deal with that? I
Yeah.
guess is my
Uh,
question.
I'm usually not too worried that people are going to like hurt themselves necessarily. Like, I'm not like, I just feel like, we're animals, you know what I mean? Like, we still have these bodies that are capable of doing a lot of things. Like, what I'm after is, if someone has it in their desire that they want to bring their fitness as far as it could possibly go, I want to build the foundation and the framework for them to be able to have that directionality that can go really far. And in order to do that, you need to be really competent at exercise. Like, I want you to be able to, like, squat well. I want you to be able to hinge well, press well, run well, change directions well, throw a ball well. And in order to be able to do that, I need you to have foundational fundamentals. Like, that, because eventually, if you do squat well, you might find yourself squatting pretty good weight for a good number of repetitions. And that can be very stressful at a certain point. And you might limit yourself how far you can go with developing yourself physically with that exercise if it's not done well. Now, a lot of like that, so I'd say that's kind of the addendum with that. For a lot of people where it's like, hey, exercise just needs to be a part of my life. I'm not looking to take it super far. That's kind of okay. Moshe Feldenkrais was a really bright guy. He originally started as a physicist working under the Curies, and he was a judo black belt in that same time period. And then he switched and dedicated his life towards understanding the human body and pain science and things of that nature. But he wrote amazing books in the 1940s and 50s on human movement. And one of the comparisons that he makes is, or things that he talks about, is the more varied things that you do, the lower skill level you need to have to be able to do those things and be just fine at it. But the fewer things that you do, the more mastery you need to have over those particular areas to keep yourself safe. He even gives the comparison of a scientist looking into a microscope and how that might lead to headaches if they don't use their eyes in a very precise manner and have very good training over that, versus somebody that's just outdoors in nature and they're looking all around and seeing different things up, down, left, right, close, far. They're never going to have like tension based visual induced migraines and headaches from that kind of experience. So if you are hiking and swimming and climbing and squatting and throwing and running and doing every different thing which way, you don't need much in the way of mastery. You'll be a jack of all trades, a master of none, and you'll be just fine. And that's probably the essence of what our species is supposed to be. But if you shrink down your total choices and you decide that you want to push one very far to like Mount Everest level development, you better be really good at that thing.
So let's say
So
someone wants to jump into CrossFit, for example, and they're 40-year-old male, probably not worked out too much. Would you say that that's okay if they're just careful, or would you say, okay, look, you probably want to get yourself a good base if you've not been an athlete in your in your younger years, get yourself a good base and then go on to do something like that.
yeah, I think that that's a pretty good way to look at it. I'd say like, for like CrossFit, where they kind of have gotten themselves in trouble in the past is taking, middle-aged people and having them do like barbell Olympic lifts or trying to do gymnastics on rings. And if you just think about those tasks, they're kind of inherently high intensity. Like what I'm talking about with like not reaching mastery is like pretty light weights and low intensity, and like you're just kind of moving around quite a bit. If I took a regular person and they had not exercised much, and I was like, okay, man, like I'm gonna make you squat a bunch of weight. We're gonna throw all the plates on the bar and go. You can do it. They're gonna get in trouble. You know what I mean? The intensity is way too high. And something similar could happen if I was like, all right, we're gonna throw you up on these gymnastics rings, and I want you to try to do a muscle up today. It's like, whoa, this person has no base to be able to do this. The task is way too hard. They might twist and contort themselves in a way to try to accomplish this thing that's well beyond their strength and fitness and skill level right now. I prefer to look at it as like, I would love to just match your current skill and ability level with an exercise that is a good meeting ground for you,
Mm.
that provides appropriate stimuli. And so that's kind of like where I'm at with like just general recommendations on exercise selection, and then you can go anywhere from, once the person has a base and an understanding and some fundamentals. Sure, open the playbook. Like a lot of times I'll talk about it from the perspective of like, imagine trying to teach a little kid how to shoot a basketball. You know, like you wouldn't want to start with a half court shot or a three pointer. Like low probability of success. They might hate it. Something bad could happen. You could see them having a temper tantrum and storming off or something like that. Start with a layup, and once they have a layup and they work the fundamentals and good coordination with it, now you can move them a little further away. You can have them run, catch the ball and shoot off the catch, dribble and shoot, left hand, right hand, hook shot, you name it. But same thing. I want to think about what is the layup version of every exercise. And that's probably a good place to start people. And if
And
all
what?
you did was know the layup, you don't have to coach it as much either.
So what about running then? There's a lot of kind of running programs, sprinting programs that you would have, and again, I'm probably talking now maybe sort of your 40-year-old plus. I'm sort of definitely in that category. Are there any sort of layup equivalents where if you're going to be doing some sort of running program, maybe where you're running, jogging, running, sprinting on a 3 or 4 times a week, and you could have like for me, I have been training. I develop a back injury. I get fairly tight in my hamstrings. Would there be things that you would, if you've not exercised, that you'd probably want to do the same sort of thing, train people to do that, so that, because I heard in another interview you talked about some of the long-term damaging effects of exercise. So you probably don't want to start with a program for 6 months and then realize 9 to 12 months later that you've actually created some other kind of injury. So is there anything as it relates to running at all?
Yeah, and like I built a universal principle guided thought process that applies to every form of exercise. You know what I mean? Like, and I won't go through the whole thing because it can just be time consuming but like one of the things that like the first exercise I would arrive at for running if I follow this is seated on the ground arm action. I don't know if you're ever like a little kid, even in gym class or something, you go into long seated with your legs straight out in front of you and you kind of pump your arms like this. And, if you like, look, like it's kind of funny, like I can give people a pretty decent workout with long seated arm action. If you really get them to like fire their arms through the zone for time. And the overall goal is you can move your arms so fast, you can actually make your butt bounce up and down off the ground because you're creating enough force. And when people learn how to use their arms and really drive them up, it's teaching them the proper posture and carriage position for running overall. And but essentially, it's the most supported position you can be in for this. Like you're on the ground itself. You have a lot of contact. You're not moving anywhere. And then I would look at how do I remove support? Well, I could stand them up, and oftentimes I'll put a band around their hips and I'll attach that band to like a squat rack or something like that so that they're in place. So then it turns into like marching in place, skipping in place, running in place. And that grades it up from slow in place to more powerful in place to more powerful and fast in place. And after that, we start to free the person from the band and they can march forward, skip forward, and do like a high knee run forward. So it's everything I do is very systematic. You know what I mean? I don't use my brain in live time. I literally just create an algorithm. And if I follow the algorithm, I don't even have to think. It's like, I just remember that it's always going to be, seated arm action followed by marching in place, followed by skipping in place, running in place, marching forward, and then you can build the person to starts and accelerations running, and then you can increase the distance, which increases the speed over time. So it's a progressive dosing of the stimulus, and that way you don't really like give them too much too soon too fast, which is the recipe for these kinds of like sudden problematic things that can really, that's where people can get hurt, and then all of a sudden like they're out for time and then they're not exercising and bad habits creep in their life and on and on and on.
You talk about this. We use the McDonald's a little bit in some of the research I've done, and I can kind of relate to it, not because I relate to McDonald's, but I understand the philosophy. What do you think is in terms of the fitness industry? What do you think are the benefits of being able to get some kind of McDonald's process in terms of training people? And do you think do you see that a lot in many of the fitness products out there, or do you think this is something that as an industry we really need to get better at? Because some of the things that you said are very simple to understand, like running. Before you go and get in a running class and you start doing the same movement 3 or 4 times a week for 30 minutes, it makes sense that you're getting some of those movement patterns right. The CrossFit example, that made sense to me. I'm sure that you've probably got a similar story if you're going to be doing any kind of cycling class. But I've
Mhm.
done many of these, and I don't see some of these basic things happening. But from my perspective, it seems as though it would be a good thing. So what are your, what is this McDonald's concept, and is this something you feel
Yeah.
that is, are we there as an industry, or we got a way to go to get there?
So I always start like first and foremost, everyone has a bias. And my bias is towards science. You know what I mean? Like and science is just another story that we have as a species. You know what I mean? Like we can I think sometimes put too much stock in it. It's our best, most accurate story for getting results so far. But, look, scientific materialism is a philosophy, and it is the one that I cling to most closely is my own mythos at this point in time. But it is largely based on understanding topics and then driving progress. You know what I mean? So I've said this before. I don't know if I believe in God, but I believe in progress. Like so. That's the thing that I generally I'm obsessed with progress. And to me, in order to be able to determine whether or not you're making progress, the first thing you have to do is standardize as many variables as you possibly can. And again, that goes back to me with my science background. I don't feel comfortable unless I've like standardized so many variables in life. Now I feel like I can point to something and say, look, if I change this one variable, it makes a big difference. Look at the power of this variable. And I don't think a lot of people think that way. You know what I mean? Like, I think most people go through life and they just live their life. And like, I probably have some pathology at this point in time about this. But I look at everything that's a gigantically successful operation. And what they've done is they've standardized their approach to a gigantic degree. And more mature industries exercise is a very immature industry. I feel like we're still pooping our diapers in a lot of ways.
Why is that?
Versus, well, it's only existed for a very short period of time. You know, um, exercise science as a thing started in the United States at the Harvard Fatigue Labs. In the very early 1900s, compared to physics and chemistry and other things, it's a baby. You know what I mean? So, and people have only been exercising. Like you think about like when did people start exercising for this concept and like maybe you can kind of point to like Venice Beach with bodybuilders and then like joggers in the 70s. But even in the 70s, most medical doctors said like you probably shouldn't exercise, it's bad for your heart, it causes your heart to grow. And so it's a very new phenomenon of people exercising, and it's like the Wild West. People do wild stuff, like there's things. I've compared exercise to the concept of life. Like I look at like Carolus Linnaeus, the guy that created the Systema Naturae and the kingdom, phylum, order, class, genus, species. And he must have looked at the planet and been like, "Oh my God, there's so many things. How do I make sense of it? Like that's a weird fish. It's got a lamp on its head. Like, why does this thing exist?" And so he tried to create all these different realms that you could categorize things through and identify them correctly and standardize the examination of looking at life on the planet, which is a crazy concept. So, for me, I just want to standardize looking at exercise. It's a strong pursuit of mine. And you have to give things a name and you have to give things a category. So I just have like a million categories. Not a million. I have 13 categories that exercise can fit into. And from there, it's like because a lot of times you look at things like you think it's new and different, but really it's just another one of these when you kind of get into it. But I think that in order to be able to know what actually works for human beings, some level of standardization of the process has to take place. And because it's too important at this point in time, in my opinion, we're going to see this more and more post COVID when we start to really parse through the data on people that died, people that were strongly affected, people that were moderately affected, minorly affected. I'm sure that it's going to be like, fitness levels, muscle mass, body fat, aerobic fitness. That's going to be the biggest variable out of everything. I think we're already seeing that. And so we need to have a more robust population. The thing that'll cause that to happen is probably money. It's just too expensive to pay for people that aren't fit, and that'll probably drive the government and other things to like actually want to make an impact. So if you're going to do that, you need some degree of a more standardized approach to giving fitness to the masses of humans, because right now it doesn't really exist. You know, there's it's way too divergent and odd right now. So I think that it's a really tough question, because it's like it almost sounds fascist to me, and like I'm a very liberal person in all honesty, where I'm like, you do your thing, man. Like I'll do my thing, you do your thing. But I also like to provide large scale solutions as well, and solve puzzles. Like I just like puzzles in life, and to me, this is the puzzle that I'm most attracted to. And so for me, like I again, I don't know if this thing I created would be usable for most people, but I think that it probably would be if it is presented to people. Um, but it's kind of at the very least, know the different like, and I talk about McDonald's a lot with this, because I'm so impressed with the standardization of the process that you can go through with McDonald's. Like you can get a quarter pounder with cheese. Well, maybe not that. If you go to France, if you've seen Pulp Fiction, it's just a broil with cheese. But the metric system. But generally speaking, you can get a similar hamburger in Singapore as you can in Kansas, as you can in Hong Kong, as you can in Albuquerque. And you can hire someone that's a minimum wage employee to be able to give you the same product. And that's
Mm-hmm.
essentially what you're probably going to get with fitness as well. There's
Do you
only
think we get
so
that at the? Do you think though, at the, like if you look at, let's take that then as fast food, the fast food industry, it is predictable. You've been
yeah,
to a KFC and a McDonald's, relatively predictable, even in sort of developing countries. Do you how far away then do you think we are as a fitness industry to being able to provide a predictable product that will give people generally what they expect to get from it, which in the case of fast food, it's like a decent meal for a decent price that kind of fills you up and is reasonably healthy. What do you think about the fitness industry as a whole then, to be able
we're
to
very,
deliver?
very far away,
Right.
very far away. And I think the major limitation is actually the employment of the people that work in fitness, where I think that if you think about fast food, people that are going to work in fast food know that they're just going to get plugged into a system, and they just have to hit a button, or they have to fill the thing with fries. They wrap the burger, they slide it down the chute, it goes into the bag. Okay. Um, and in fitness, the people that work in fitness are oftentimes, I love people that work in fitness. They oftentimes are very ambitious and excited and all that kind of stuff. But they also don't like to be told what to do oftentimes. They don't like to follow systems. It's kind of like that would be the primary problem I could see at this point in time, is like you're not going to get a standardized thing because every trainer thinks they've got a different answer. And I saw this teaching exercise science as a professor with students, is there it's like, hey, I want to teach you the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines for what they recommend for exercise, and everyone's got a problem with every single part of it, and like, they shouldn't do it this way. And it's like, you're 19 years old, just listen to what this organization is telling you to do. Like, stop recreating the wheel. They considered a lot of things that went into this model. Like, I get it. It's not that exciting. I used to tell them this when I would teach the ACSM guidelines for exercise testing and prescription. I said, okay, the ACSM guidelines are to exercise as Will Smith is to rap. Okay. It's not the most exciting rap. All right. But here's the cool thing about Will Smith: you can play it under any circumstances. You can play it at a barbecue. You can play it in front of your grandmother. You can play it in front of your high school principal, your friends. No one's going to have a problem with it. There's certainly more sophisticated rap and controversial rap, but you can't play it for everyone. You need to find the Will Smith version of rap for exercise for the masses. It fits for more people. And so once I told them that, they were like, oh, gotcha. Okay.
Do you think also a lot of cases, I talk to a lot of trainers, and whether it's athletes, celebrities, and everything in between, and I'm amazed at how many of them, when you actually talk about their programs, how it's very simple, and it's almost like, you mean I'm paying you that much to tell me this? Do you think in some cases it's really, it's pretty straightforward in terms, and I'm not trying to play down what you're doing anyway, but
Yeah.
some of it isn't that complicated. It's just, trying to do things consistently in the right way, in the right sort of sequence, and you can actually get what you want.
Yeah, I mean, especially for general population, the playbook should be this big. It should be tiny. You know what I mean? Like you're going to squat, you're going to hinge, you're going to press, you're going to pull, and you're going to do rhythmic aerobic cardio. Done. I might sprinkle in, like, that's the big rocks. I might sprinkle in some of the other things, but that's the seasoning on the stew. And I don't want to overwhelm the stew with the salt and the pepper and the spices. Now it's a different thing. And so, when it comes to other things, like if I'm trying to train, if I've been working with clay court tennis players and I've been working with them for 3, 4 years, they're going to have some things that might look like exotic movements. If I'm trying to train the skateboarders that are trying to win the gold medal at the Olympics, and I've been working with them for a few years, they're going to have some exotic looking things because of the demands of their sport and the positions and planes and angles that they have to move through to be able to do what they need to do. But most people don't need to go out on Roland Garros and return 114 mile an hour serve in like a lateral split position with their neck turned one way and their torso turned a completely other way and put it on the baseline. Like, it's just like, that's not part of your life. So it really is. I've I again, I do a lot of education of other fitness providers, and I'm like, hey, how many of you saw Terminator 2? Like, most people have seen that thing. I'm like, where they go down to Mexico, and it's where Sarah Connor's friends are that were preparing for the apocalypse, and they open that hatch and they go down in the ammunition station and they got all the guns. Like, I feel like fitness people want all the guns. And it's like, you only need like one of them. You know what I mean? It's nice to know that you got the rocket launcher and the machine gun that go, but you probably don't need all of those things. It's cool that you can have them, but the likelihood that you're going to need some of the exotic ones is very low. You might find yourself in very rarely kind of resorting to those as the appropriate tool. But most great worksmen, craftsmen, they tend to go back to the same tools because they tend to find, hey, this job isn't really that different than most of the other jobs.
So if you had advice for the next generation of trainers based on what we've said, then is some of it down to sort of really creating mastery with some of those basics? Like, my wife does jiu-jitsu, for example, and with my kids, and they get quite bored of doing the fundamentals, but we have this conversation about the importance of the fundamentals, and the people who do really well just have got them down to, they can just get you in that position straight away. Is that really part of it? It's just like, I know it's boring, but if you can be a master of some of those fundamentals, you are going to be way better than the majority of people out there.
Yeah, I tend to believe that. Two things come to my mind from martial arts. You always have to put in a good Bruce Lee quote. And the one that really applies here is him saying, I do not fear the man that has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I do fear the man that has practiced one kick 10,000 times. And I also did jujitsu years ago, and my coach, I remember him just saying, like, hey man, there's only so many ways you can break somebody's arm. Okay. It basically just involves putting your hips like a puzzle piece into the other person's shoulder socket. And you can get there from the mount, from the side mount, from flying positions from your guard. But eventually you just realize you're just fitting like a puzzle piece, hips into shoulder socket. If you see that available to you, you take it, and the arm goes this way, thumb up, that'll do the job. And it's kind of like, actually, yeah, that's exactly what it is. So very similarly, like I always I'm like, look, like practice one squat that you can do effectively a lot of times. And then when you find yourself under different circumstances, a different gym, new bars, new implements, you have a really good squat pattern lodged in your brain. You know, uh, the way I try to make this point to people is, okay, so you could imagine, you could imagine that you're signing your name on a piece of paper in front of you with a pen right now. Anybody can do this if they're listening. And then take your elbow and point it in front of you, and I guarantee you could sign your name into the air in front of you with your elbow. And you could do it with your nose. And you could point your toe and you can sign your name with your toe. Nobody needed to teach you that, but you practiced this one motor pattern of sign your name so many times that the memory is so beautifully lodged in your brain, and the way that it unfolds in the pattern, it's there, and you can just call on it and do it in such a number of different circumstances. It's very similar to, like, if you know how to run, you don't have to relearn how to run for every new hill that you go up, and for every new route, and for every, you know, object that could get in your way. The environment, as it changes, your body unfolds and does it perfectly to meet those confines. Now, if you want to get better in certain confines, I say this, like, look, if I put paint on your elbow and I made you sign your name on a big white thing in front of you on the wall, it might look a little bit sloppier. But if I put you on a 6 week program of signing your name on that paper with your elbow, and you did 3 sets of 10 repetitions 3 times a week, I guarantee after 6 weeks, that signature with your elbow would look a lot better. But do you need to do this? Probably not. What do you need to do? Find out what you need to do and include that. Like a great gardener is not someone that just goes and plants more and more trees and more bushes and more flowers. They're usually someone that prunes it and brings it down. And oftentimes, a minimalist presentation is the most beautiful and aesthetically pleasant. And oftentimes, that is the same thing that occurs with a training regimen for someone. Do what you need, but don't do more than what you need. And hone the craft, as opposed to just trying to add more, add more, add more, add more. You probably get more juice from the squeeze with that approach, as opposed to just willy-nilly flinging things around, new thing all the time.
Well, I've got one final question, Pat. But before that, I just wanted to probably wanted you to share this, because you've got some really interesting programs for trainers that you've got out there at the moment. So I wonder whether you could just share a little bit about a couple of the programs that you've got available and where people can go to find out about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I have the certification system that I put together, which is called Rethinking the Big Patterns. And when I describe this thing, it really is, it is a systematic approach towards being able to make better exercise selections for the people that you work with, and giving you an exact pathway on how to progress those exercise selections until you land in the region of exercises that's really appropriate for each specific individual that you might work with, based on their needs analysis, and kind of analyzing who they are as a person. Um, that's the fundamentals of that seminar or that certification. It's broken up into resistance patterns, so the big lifting stuff, athletic patterns. So if you're working with athletes, and that one's kind of like running, jumping, throwing, and changing directions. And then the third seminar is control patterns, and that one's breathing and core exercises. And that one's really for, like, hey, if you're working at a very high level and you need to be able to change the movement capabilities of a person, this is how you actually accomplish that. Like if you want to give someone more range of motion or access to better motor control, this is the strategic pathway to be able to do that. So yeah, I put a lot of time into developing that seminar series and certification. There's a book that goes along with it, a coach's guide to optimizing movement. And the other thing that I offer is something called Athletic Weapon, and that is a pretty advanced training offering. It's actually my own training. Like I've been exercising for a long, long time. 30 years for me of dedicated, consistent effort in exercise. It is my life in a lot of ways, and I do find that a lot of other fitness professionals end up really enjoying this product because it's like if you really take this seriously and you really are like, hey man, I like to train really hard. I like to push my body to very, very far levels and high levels. And that's what I did with the creation of this product. It is now 2 years of program design that I've been following, and I just we have a pretty good community of people in there. It's mostly fitness people, and then there's actually a lot of like special forces, military guys that are in there too. So it's a good group, but it's yeah. If you want to see what I actually do in my own training, that's kind of what I did, and everything's documented in there. Like I write out everything. I write out exactly what I eat and follow from a dietary perspective, the all the exercise choices, the program design, the training splits and percentages. And if you really love training, that's my life. I love training and all the sophisticated periodization designs and sprinting, lifting, power development, you name it. It's kind of in there. So I have a lot of fun with it. It really is. It is my ultimate pet project.
Right, and that's on your. That can be found on your website. Is it?
You
What's the
know,
website address?
I'm terrible with actually all of my own business stuff. I have someone that runs my business stuff. I don't even know the name. I don't even know the website address. Everything I know
Okay.
runs through my Instagram. I am on Instagram with at Dr. Pat Davidson, Dr. period Pat Davidson. You can get everything through the link. I'm sure the website's on there too. But I found out where my strengths are in life, and administrative stuff and running the business side is not one of them. So I have like horrifically outsourced that to the point of like actually being practically clueless in the operations of my own stuff,
Right.
um, which
Well, we'll
is
include
kind
it
of
in the. We'll include it on the YouTube channel and in the show notes for the podcast. So we'll help you out on that side, Pat.
absolutely. It's kind of like I don't even want to admit it, but that's the truth.
No problem. So my final question then, Pat, escape your limits is about escaping what you've believed is impossible and gone on to make possible. What would be a memorable example of you escaping your own personal limits?
I mean, that's. I think it's easy for me with some of the big rocks. I'm a recovering alcoholic and drug addict, and my family situation is not great. Like I never really knew my father. He's alcoholic, someone that was in and out of prison. As far as I know, I don't know if the guy's alive or dead. He's untrackable. My mother died of a drug overdose when I was 19. I've had a number of other family members, drug problems, other things like that. And so I got sober when I was 23 years old, and I was a bad drug addict and alcoholic. You know what I mean? Like very bad problems with cocaine and crack and alcohol and you name it. Like and I think I was looking at very short lifespan, either going to be in prison or dead by my mid to late 20s. I definitely wasn't making it past that. So once I was able to get sober, I was, very, very nicely directed by the person that coached me in mixed martial arts. And I really feel like that man really helped save my life and get me on a trajectory. And once I was able to get on a trajectory, I'm a pretty smart person. I'm very good at reading and writing and synthesizing information and building conceptual models and theoretical designs behind things and understanding how to actually create gigantic systems. So I never would have thought that. You know what I mean? I literally was just like so in my own way as a young man, and I still have tremendous self-destructive tendencies. I mean, really bad issues in life that can really sabotage me. So I still have to be aware of that stuff, and I still do a lot of 12-step recovery things and a lot of therapy and things of that nature because I have a lot of historical stuff that is implanted and kind of can take me into some really bad directions. So I like to be open and honest about that because I know that people can be like, wow, but you're really smart and you've really done a lot of things. And it's like, I know, but I also trust me, there's another side of me that can really go off the rails at any second without a lot of management. But if I'm able to keep myself directed and following a program, and I've learned a lot about outsourcing my own decision making through 12-step recovery and things like that. And I've really tried to utilize that with building systems for people for decision making for exercise and fitness and things like that, to be honest. So yeah, I mean, I think that I could be just another very classical example of someone that would have, committed suicide in their 20s or died in a violent experience. But, I'm 43 now. It's been 20 years of me being able to be sober and stringing together a couple of decades of good solid work.
Well, look, I'm glad that's the case because there's some wonderful stuff that you've done, and I'm sure you've got a lot more in you yet. So I'm glad you're here to do the podcast, and please keep up the good work. And I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us today, Pat. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you've got any value from it whatsoever, then please do us a favor, like, subscribe, tell somebody, and that will help us to be able to continue to do more of these and help you escape your own personal limits. Thanks for listening.